11 p.m. Calvin Hayes pushed his mop bucket past the boardroom, where executives' voices rose in panic behind glass walls. He paused, not because of their fear, but because he recognized the problem they were describing. The same flaw he'd warned them about a decade ago, before they forced him out. In his pocket, a pen and the back of a receipt. In his locker, his daughter's drawing of a rocket ship. And the weight of knowing he could save them all, if anyone would listen to a janitor. The system was failing. $100 million on the line. 12 hours until launch. Calvin had built this company's foundation. Then they buried his name and handed him a mop. The hallway stretched empty before him, polished floors reflecting the cold overhead lights. Calvin's work boots made soft, squeaking sounds as he moved his cleaning cart along the corridor of Tech Vault Solutions' executive wing. It was the kind of silence that came after everyone important had gone home, leaving only the people no one noticed to keep the building running. He'd worked the night shift for 3 years now, long enough that his body had adjusted to sleeping while Ruthie was at school, waking up in time to make her dinner before heading back here. Long enough that he knew which offices left their trash cans overflowing, which break rooms needed extra attention on Mondays, which bathroom stalls had temperamental flush handles. Long enough that he'd become invisible. That's what happened when you wore a grey uniform with your first name stitched on the chest pocket. People looked through you, not at you. They held conversations right in front of you about sensitive projects, private matters, company secrets, never once considering that the man emptying their wastebaskets might understand every word, might even know more than they did. Calvin had learned to prefer it this way. Invisibility was safer than recognition. Recognition led to questions. Questions led to his past. And his past was something he'd spent 10 years trying to bury deeper than Tech Vault had buried his name from their company history. Tonight felt different, though. The energy in the building had been off all day. He'd noticed it during his dinner break when he'd passed through the cafeteria. Engineers clustered in tight groups, voices low and urgent, laptops open with screens full of cascading error messages. One of them had been running his hands through his hair repeatedly, a gesture Calvin recognized. Stress. The kind that came from knowing something was badly wrong and not knowing how to fix it. Calvin had paused by the coffee station longer than necessary, refilling the sugar dispensers slowly, listening. "The stress tests keep failing," one engineer had said. "Every single simulation shows the same cascade failure at the 30-hour mark." "We've checked the algorithm 17 times," another replied. "The math is solid. It has to be something else. The launch is tomorrow night. If we can't certify system stability, the whole contract falls apart." Calvin had moved on before they noticed him standing there, but the words had lodged in his mind like a splinter. Cascade failure at 30 hours. He knew that pattern. Knew it the way you know the sound of your own child's footsteps coming down the hall. Now, pushing his mop bucket past the boardroom, he heard those same voices again, but this time they carried the edge of real panic. Through the glass walls he could see 6 people gathered around the conference table, their faces illuminated by the glow of a massive display screen. Veronica Sterling stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, her expression carved from ice and tension. Calvin had seen her around the building often enough. Everyone had. She'd taken over as CEO 3 years ago, right around the time Calvin had started working nights. Young for the position, late 30s maybe, but sharp as a blade. She had a reputation for being fair but demanding, the kind of leader who expected excellence and didn't accept excuses. She'd grown the company's government contracts by 40%, launched 2 successful products, and generally seemed to know exactly what she was doing. Except right now, she looked like someone standing on the deck of a sinking ship. "Walk me through it again," she said, her voice carrying through the glass. "In simple terms, what exactly goes wrong?" A man in a rumpled button-down, Calvin recognized him as one of the senior systems engineers, pulled up a visualization on the screen. The core algorithm manages data flow across distributed networks. It's designed to auto-balance loads and prevent any single node from becoming a bottleneck. Everything works perfectly in standard conditions. But, Veronica prompted, but when we stress test it, push it to the kind of capacity it'll face in real-world government applications, it hits a critical threshold around 30 hours of sustained high traffic. The system starts making micro-adjustments to compensate, which creates a feedback loop. Small imbalances cascade into bigger ones. Eventually, the whole network crashes. And we can't just limit the capacity. Not without violating contract specifications. We promised the DoD a system that could handle sustained peak loads for 72 hours minimum. Right now, we can't even guarantee 36 hours without catastrophic failure. Another voice joined in, Preston York, the CFO. Calvin knew him by reputation even before he'd started working here. Preston had been with TechVault for 15 years, worked his way up from junior analyst to the C-suite, and had his fingerprints on every major financial decision the company made. He dressed expensively, spoke confidently, and had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. We've invested 18 months and $23 million in this project, Preston said. The contract is worth $100 million over 5 years. If we don't launch on schedule, the penalty clauses kick in. We lose the contract, we lose the penalty fees, and we lose our credibility with every government agency that matters. I'm aware of the stakes, Preston, Veronica said coolly. What I need is a solution. The solution is to launch anyway, Preston replied. The failure point is theoretical. It's based on stress tests, not real-world usage. In actual deployment, the system might never hit those extreme conditions. The engineer shook his head. That's not how probability works. If the flaw exists, it'll manifest eventually. Maybe not in the first month, but then we have a month to patch it post-launch. Preston interrupted. We've got the best engineers in the industry. They'll figure it out. Or, Veronica said quietly, we could delay the launch. Take the penalty hit now, fix the problem properly, and launch a system we know works. Preston's expression hardened. That's not a viable business decision. The penalties alone would cost us $12 million, plus the reputational damage, plus the chance that DoD pulls the contract entirely and goes with a competitor. Calvin had stopped moving entirely now. His hands rested on the mop handle, his body still, but his mind was racing. He knew this conversation, knew it bone deep, because he'd been part of an almost identical one 10 years ago, in this same building, with some of the same people. Back then, he'd been the one standing at that conference table. Dr. Calvin Hayes, lead systems architect. He'd built TechVault's first major algorithm from the ground up, the one that had won them their first government contract and established their reputation in the industry. He'd been proud of that work. Proud enough that when he'd discovered a potential flaw in the cost-cutting modifications the finance team wanted to make, he'd spoken up immediately. He'd thought, that's what you were supposed to do. Find problems, report them, fix them. He'd thought his responsibility was to the integrity of the work, to the safety of the systems they were building. He'd been wrong about what mattered more to some people. The argument had lasted weeks. Calvin had shown them the data, the simulations, the proof that the modified design would fail under specific conditions. The conditions were rare but not impossible. The failure would be catastrophic. They needed to spend another 6 months and another $2 million to do it right. Preston York had been a junior financial analyst back then, but he'd already been influential. Ambitious. Good at making spreadsheets tell the story management wanted to hear. He'd argued that Calvin was being overly cautious, that the failure scenario was so unlikely it wasn't worth the delay and expense, that perfectionism was the enemy of profitability. Calvin had pushed back, had gone over heads, written memos, refused to sign off on the design, had made himself into an obstacle that needed to be removed. So they'd removed him. Quietly. A restructuring. A position elimination. A generous severance package attached to a non-disclosure agreement and a non-compete clause. By the time Calvin realized what was happening, his access badges had been deactivated, his name had been stripped from the project documentation, and Preston York had taken credit for the algorithm's success. The modified design had worked well enough. The specific failure conditions Calvin had warned about never materialized, or at least never materialized publicly. TechVault had grown. Preston had risen. And Calvin had discovered that having your name on a toxic NDA made you essentially unhireable in the industry, at least at the level he'd been working. The money from the severance package had lasted 2 years. Then came the temp jobs, the contract work, the gradual slide down the ladder of respectability. His wife had left when Ruthie was 4, unable to handle the uncertainty, the financial stress, the way Calvin seemed to have given up on fighting back. By the time Ruthie was 6, Calvin was working retail. By the time she was 7, he was applying for custodial positions. The night shift at TechVault had felt like a bitter irony when he'd first seen the job posting. But it paid better than most janitorial work, offered health insurance, and had predictable hours that let him be there for Ruthie when she needed him. So he'd applied under his legal first name only, left his PhD off the resume, and tried not to think about the fact that he was mopping floors in the building where he'd once designed revolutionary algorithms. Now, standing outside that boardroom, listening to history repeat itself, Calvin felt something shift in his chest. A weight he'd been carrying for so long he'd stopped noticing it. The weight of silence, of invisibility, of accepting that some battles couldn't be won. Ruthie had asked him something 2 weeks ago while he was helping her with her science fair project. She was building a model to demonstrate structural stability, how different designs handled pressure and stress. She'd looked up at him with those serious 9-year-old eyes and said, "Dad, if you know something important, you have to tell people, right? Even if they don't want to hear it?" He'd told her yes. Of course, yes. That's what integrity meant. That's what being a good person required. She'd smiled and gone back to her model, satisfied with his answer. And Calvin had felt like a hypocrite because he'd stopped believing that years ago. He'd learned that telling the truth didn't matter if no one with power wanted to listen. But Ruthie still believed it. Still believed that truth mattered, that speaking up mattered, that the right answer should win out over the convenient one. Inside the boardroom, the argument was escalating. Voices rising, overlapping, frustration bleeding into anger. The engineer was insisting the floor was real and dangerous. Preston was pushing for launch. Veronica was trapped between them, trying to find a path that didn't lead to disaster in one direction or another. Calvin made a decision. It was possibly stupid, probably pointless, but he was tired of being invisible. Tired of staying silent, tired of letting the wrong thing happen just because it was safer not to care. He pushed his mop bucket to the side, pulled the pen from his pocket, and grabbed a napkin from the cleaning cart. His hands moved quickly, muscle memory taking over. The equation wrote itself, the core algorithm structure, the modification points where Preston's cost-cutting had introduced instability, the correction factor that would stabilize the system. It was elegant, really. Simple. He'd figured it out 10 years ago and never gotten the chance to implement it. He folded the napkin, walked to the boardroom door, and knocked. The conversation inside stopped abruptly. 6 faces turned toward the glass, expressions ranging from annoyed to confused. Calvin opened the door. "Excuse me, Ms. Sterling. I think I know how to fix your problem." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Preston York's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and then something darker. He knew. After 10 years, after everything, he knew exactly who Calvin was. "Security," Preston said coldly. "We have a situation." But Veronica held up one hand. She was staring at Calvin with an expression he couldn't quite read. Curiosity, maybe. Or just the desperation of someone with no good options left. "Wait. Let him speak." Calvin stepped into the room. His work uniform felt suddenly very obvious, very wrong in this space of expensive suits and advanced degrees. But he'd already committed. He walked to the conference table and set down the napkin with its scrawled equation. "Your cascade failure starts at 30 hours because you're using a static load-balancing coefficient," he said quietly. "The algorithm tries to maintain equilibrium by making fixed percentage adjustments. But at high sustained capacity, those adjustments compound faster than the system can compensate. You need a dynamic coefficient that scales with traffic density and adjusts the rebalancing threshold in real time." The engineer leaned forward, studying the napkin. His eyes widened. That would actually work. The scaling function here, if we integrate it into the core loop." "Who are you?" Veronica interrupted. She wasn't looking at the napkin. She was looking at Calvin's face. Really looking, the way most people hadn't in years. "His name is Calvin Hayes," Preston said before Calvin could answer. His voice carried a warning. "He used to work here. A long time ago. He signed a very comprehensive NDA when he left. He shouldn't be discussing proprietary systems." "I'm not discussing proprietary systems," Calvin said evenly. "I'm discussing my own work. The algorithm you're using is based on the design I created. The flaw you're hitting is the one I warned you about 10 years ago. The fix I just showed you is the one I proposed back then." He turned to Veronica. "Before I was removed from the project and Preston took credit for my design." The temperature in the room dropped. Veronica's expression shifted from curious to very, very sharp. "Preston? This is absurd," Preston said quickly. "Calvin was a junior engineer who was let go during a restructuring. He's apparently harbored a grudge ever since. Whatever he thinks he contributed, pull up the original project files," Calvin said to Veronica. "The ones from 10 years ago, before the first government contract. Look at the architecture documentation. Look at who filed the initial patent applications. Look at the email threads about the design modifications and who raised concerns." Veronica turned to the engineer. "Can you do that?" The engineer was already typing on his laptop. The large display screen shifted, showing file directories, archived documents, email chains. Calvin watched Preston's face lose color as page after page loaded. There it was. All of it. The original designs with Calvin's name on every document. The patent applications listing Dr. Calvin Hayes as primary inventor. The email exchanges where he'd outlined the exact flaw they were currently facing, proposed the exact solution he'd just written on a napkin, and been overruled by financial considerations and aggressive timelines. And there, in the final emails and summals, Preston's recommendations to eliminate Calvin's position. Preston's memos taking ownership of the algorithm. Preston's signature on the NDA that had kept Calvin silent for a decade. Veronica read in silence for what felt like an hour, but was probably less than 5 minutes. When she finally looked up, her expression was carved from ice. "Preston, my office, now." "Veronica, you need to understand the context. Now." She turned to Calvin. "Mr. Hayes, I'd like you to stay. Work with the engineering team. Show them how to implement your fix." She paused. "Please." Calvin nodded slowly. The engineer was already pulling up code on another screen, making room at the table. Preston stood frozen for a moment, then turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. For the next 4 hours, Calvin worked. It felt strange at first, sitting at that table, talking through complex systems architecture, writing code on whiteboards instead of mopping floors. But his mind fell into the rhythm of it like coming home. The engineers listened, asked smart questions, pushed back on a few points in ways that made the solution stronger. Around 3 in the morning, one of them, a woman named Rebecca, who couldn't have been older than 25, looked up from her laptop and said quietly, "It's working. System's been running stable at full capacity for 45 minutes. Stress test projections show it holding past 72 hours. The relief in the room was palpable. Someone laughed. Someone else suggested getting coffee. Rebecca just sat back in her chair and stared at Calvin. "You really did build this whole system, didn't you? Like the foundation of everything we've been working with." "A long time ago," Calvin said. "Why are you working as a janitor?" It was such a simple question, so impossibly complicated to answer. Calvin just shrugged. Sometimes life doesn't go the way you plan. Veronica returned around 4 in the morning. She looked tired, and there was something grim in her expression. "Preston is no longer with the company," she said without preamble. "Security is clearing his office. The board will be informed in the morning." She turned to Calvin. "We need to talk. But first, did the fix work?" "Running stable," Rebecca confirmed. "We're going to monitor it through the day, but it looks solid." Veronica nodded. Then she looked at Calvin for a long moment. "I owe you an apology. The company owes you considerably more than that." "You weren't here 10 years ago," Calvin said. "No, but I've been running this company for 3 years, and I should have known its real history. Should have questioned why someone as talented as Preston claimed to be never seemed to produce anything new." She shook her head. "Come to my office, please." They sat in Veronica's office as dawn started to lighten the sky outside. She'd pulled more files, including the severance agreement Calvin had signed, the NDA, the non-compete. She read through them with the focus of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. "These are toxic," she said finally. "Legally borderline, ethically indefensible. They were designed to bury you." She looked up. "I can't undo what happened, but I can make sure it doesn't define what happens next, if you're willing." "Willing to what?" Calvin asked. "Come back, not as a janitor, as what you should have been all along." She pulled out a notepad, started writing. "Head of Ethical Systems Architecture. New position, new department. Your job is to review every algorithm we build, every system we design, and tell me the truth about what works and what doesn't. No matter what finance says, no matter what the timeline pressure is, no matter who wants to hear something different." Calvin stared at her. "You're serious?" "I'm serious about not losing $100 million contracts because someone cut corners a decade ago. I'm serious about building systems that work. And I'm serious about making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else here." She slid the notepad across the desk. The salary she'd written made Calvin's breath catch. "I have a daughter," he said quietly. "She's 9. I need to be there when she gets home from school." "Then work 7 to 3, or 8 to 4, or whatever schedule lets you be there. I don't care when you're in the building. I care that you're willing to tell me when something's wrong." Calvin picked up the notepad, stared at the number, tried to imagine what it would feel like to not worry about rent, about Ruthie's next dentist appointment, about whether his car would last another year. Tried to imagine coming back to this building every day, not as someone invisible, but as someone valued. "There's one condition," he said. "Name it." "The night shift janitor position. When you replace me. Make sure it pays enough. Make sure it comes with good insurance. Make sure whoever takes it gets treated like they matter." Veronica smiled, just slightly. deal. 3 weeks later, Calvin stood in front of his daughter's science fair display. Ruthie's project on structural stability had won second place in the district competition. She was beaming, explaining to judges and parents how different materials handled stress, how the right design could prevent cascade failures, how sometimes the smallest adjustment could save an entire structure. Calvin watched her and thought about his own cascade failure, and how the smallest adjustment, a knock on a door, a napkin with an equation, had changed everything. Veronica had been true to her word. Preston was gone, his false credentials and stolen credit exposed. The system had launched on time, working perfectly. Calvin's name had been restored to the patents, the documentation, the company history. He had an office now, a team, a salary that let him breathe. But the best part wasn't any of that. The best part was Ruthie's face when she'd seen him the first day he came home from work in the afternoon instead of the morning, when he'd been able to help with homework instead of collapsing into bed, when he'd had energy left over for her, for conversations, for being present. "You were right," he'd told her that first day. "If you know something important, you have to tell people, even if they don't want to hear it." She'd hugged him and said, "I know, Dad. You taught me that." Now, watching her explain structural stability to a crowd of impressed adults, Calvin understood that he'd taught her something else too. Something more important than any algorithm or equation. He'd taught her that sometimes you fall, and sometimes you get knocked down, and sometimes you spend years invisible and ignored. But if you hold on to who you are, if you hold on to what you know is true, eventually the right moment comes. And when it does, you have to be ready to speak up. Even if you're just a janitor with a mop bucket and a napkin. Especially then. The science fair wound down. Calvin and Ruthie walked to the car together, her second-place ribbon pinned proudly to her jacket. "Dad," she said, as he opened the car door for her, "do you think I could be an engineer someday? Like you?" Calvin smiled. "Kiddo, I think you can be anything you want. And whatever you choose, I'll be there to help you get there." She climbed into the car, already talking about next year's project, about bigger ideas, about problems she wanted to solve. Calvin listened to every word, grateful beyond measure for this second chance, not just at his career, but at being the father she deserved. Behind them, TechVault's headquarters stood against the evening sky, its lights beginning to glow as the night shift arrived. Calvin thought about the people cleaning those offices, maintaining those buildings, doing the invisible work that kept everything running. He thought about how easy it was to look past them, how dangerous it was to assume that titles and uniforms told you everything about what someone knew, what they'd done, what they were capable of. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, but he'd learned it thoroughly, and in his new position, he made sure it was a lesson TechVault learned too. Every meeting, every design review, every time someone suggested cutting corners or ignoring warnings, Calvin was there to ask the hard questions, to insist on the right answers, to make sure that doing things properly mattered more than doing them quickly. It wasn't always popular, but Veronica backed him every time. And slowly, the company culture shifted. Problems got reported instead of buried. Junior employees felt safe speaking up. The truth became more valuable than convenient fiction. 6 months after that night in the boardroom, Calvin attended a company-wide meeting where Veronica announced new policies: transparency in project documentation, protection for whistleblowers, mandatory ethics reviews for all major systems. She'd invited Calvin to speak about why these changes mattered. He'd kept it simple, told them about his daughter's science fair project, about structural stability, about how small flaws become catastrophic failures if you ignore them long enough. Told them that everyone in the building, from the CEO to the newest janitor, had valuable knowledge, and the company's job was to make sure that knowledge could be shared. When he finished, the applause was genuine. But the best part came after, when one of the night shift custodians, a man Calvin had worked alongside for 3 years, approached him quietly. "Mr. Hayes," he said, and there was something careful in his voice. "I noticed something about the new server configuration in Building C. Might be nothing, but the ventilation seems wrong. Could cause overheating." Calvin smiled. "That's not nothing. That's exactly what we need to know. Come with me. Let's find the facilities manager and get it checked." The custodian blinked, surprised. "Really? You'll listen?" "Always," Calvin said. "That's the whole point." As they walked together through Tech Vault's gleaming hallways, one man in a suit, one in a grey uniform, both equally valued, Calvin thought about how far he'd come. From invisible to indispensable. From silenced to heard. From someone who'd given up fighting to someone who fought every single day. All because of one night, one decision, one refusal to stay silent when silence was safer. All because he'd remembered what he'd taught his daughter, that truth matters, that speaking up matters, that the right answer should win. Sometimes it takes longer than it should. Sometimes the cost is higher than it should be. But eventually, if you hold on, if you stay true, the moment comes. And when it does, you knock on that door. You write that equation. You speak that truth. Even if your hands are rough from years of holding a mop. Especially then. Because real strength isn't about titles or offices or corner suites. It's about knowing who you are when no one's looking. It's about holding on to your integrity when letting go would be easier. It's about teaching your daughter, and everyone else watching, that your worth isn't determined by how others see you, but by how you see yourself. Calvin Hayes had learned that lesson in the hardest possible way. But he'd learned it completely, and now, every day, he got to live it. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a triumph. That was worth more than any algorithm, any patent, any salary. That was worth everything.